There is a new regulation, actually quite a substantial legislative package, and European, that in the coming months will significantly disrupt the balance of power online, especially between the big players and consumers. It's still not talked about enough, but that's because it has just come into effect. It's called the Digital Services Act, DSA. It is crucial to understand it well because, from my point of view, it will have a much greater impact on business and consumers than the GDPR, the European Union's privacy regulation. Get ready as we stop and discover its history, who it applies to, what the new rights are, and most importantly, what new rules it imposes, which you need to prepare well for, both as consumers because you have a lot more rights, and especially if you do business online. I am Matteo Flora, this is my job, and this is a new episode of Ciao Internet for in-depth analysis. Hello Internet, let's start from the beginning. What is the DSA and its history? Well, the Digital Services Act, or DSA, is a legislative package proposed by the European Union to regulate the digital market. Actually, it is to create an online environment according to it, as it was written, more secure and responsible. The DSA was proposed in December 2020 as part of the Shaping Europe's Digital Future strategy, and actually represents an update to an old regulation from 2000, the Psycho E-commerce Directive. The e-commerce directive, which those working in the sector know inside out, was somewhat aimed at creating a regulatory framework for the European digital market. But in the last 20 years, the digital landscape has changed quite a bit. It has drastically changed, making it somewhat necessary to update and modernize some regulations. The DSA was created to address the challenges of today's digital market and to try to ensure, though we will see if it succeeds or not, a safer, more transparent, and more responsible online environment. These are the 3 points: safety, transparency, and responsibility. Let's start from the beginning. Who does it apply to? The DSA applies to all digital service providers operating in the European Union, regardless of their origin, meaning those targeting the European market. This definition therefore includes a vast range of actors in the digital market: online platforms, social networks, online marketplaces, and even all intermediary services, from housing to online showcases to services. The DSA establishes rules and obligations that vary depending on the size of the company and, consequently, the impact of these companies on the European digital market. And it pays a lot of attention to the so-called gatekeepers, which are those very large online platforms that hold significant, sometimes almost monopolistic and market power, aiming to protect citizens against the abuses of these potential platforms. There are a lot of things it imposes, but let's quickly look at the main new rights and rules imposed by the DSA. Basically, the DSA introduces a series of both new rights and rules that, as I mentioned before, aim to ensure a somewhat safer, more transparent, and responsible online environment. The 3 act lines we discussed. Among the main innovations that, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some, one of the most important is greater transparency. The DSA requires online platforms to be more transparent about their content moderation policies, the functioning of their algorithms, and advertising. Platforms must also publish periodic reports on the implementation of these policies and the measures taken to combat illegal or harmful content, such as what they moderate, what they delete in relation to online hate, and so on. The second important part is user protection. The DSA introduces a series of new mechanisms aimed at protecting users from illegal or harmful content, as we mentioned, and ensuring the respect of fundamental rights. Platforms will need to adopt necessary and effective measures to prevent the spread of illegal content, and to respond, to act quickly to user reports. And here you can already see a whole new world opening up. First, preventing the spread of content is one of the biggest and most open problems, which means great control and above all responding quickly to user reports is another part that becomes very difficult, especially for the giants. Oh, the DSA imposes some nice and interesting sanctions. As I was saying, the third point is and the accountability of the platforms. The DSA can clarifies the responsibility of online platforms in relation to user-published content and their WASI actions. So, platforms will still be required to implement measures to identify and remove illegal content. Not only will they be required to cooperate with the activities of the competent authorities, but this principle of non-liability remains, whereby digital service providers are not responsible for user-generated content, meaning what users do and not the platform itself. However, and this is the interesting part, they remain non-liable. Unless they had knowledge of the illegal content and did not act promptly to remove it or disable access to it, reports become crucial. Why do they become crucial? Because if I can prove that I reported the illegal content and the platform did not act quickly enough, the liability exemption regime falls apart, which is huge. Then there's the regulation of gatekeepers. The DSA introduces specific rules for large gatekeepers, VLOPs, which we'll discuss later, that hold significant market power. These platforms must comply with a series of obligations designed to ensure a higher level of competition and to try to prevent anti-competitive behavior. Among these obligations are data sharing with other companies and non-discrimination against other services. For example, do you remember when Twitter started blocking those who posted links to other platforms? So you can't do this anymore without many. The non-discrimination towards, as I was saying, other services, the facilitation of interoperability between different platforms, and here we will probably make another video because in the chat part, the cooperation of chat and encryption together doesn't work particularly well. They are not things that can work very well. However, there are obviously a whole series of implementations that have more to do with specific domains, such as the enhanced protection of minors that we have seen strongly advocated by the regulator. Platforms will need to redesign GAC in their systems to ensure a high level of privacy and security and protection for minors. For example, targeted advertising based on profiling minors is no longer allowed, so all systems, including editorial systems, must exclude content dedicated to or potentially viewed by minors. This is huge. Specific risk assessments are required, meaning that the harmful effects on mental health must be evaluated and presented to the Commission 4 months after the designation as large gatekeepers. Then we will see who they have designated, and quite these assessments must be made public no later than 1 year after. And then the platforms will have to redefine their services, including interfaces, recommendation systems, and general terms to obviously mitigate the risks. Then there's an interesting part regarding moderation, because the DSA calls for more diligent content moderation and less disinformation. That is, platforms and search engines must adopt measures to address the risks associated with the spread of illegal services online and the negative effects on freedom of expression and information. This is the correct wording. That is, they must have clear general conditions and apply them diligently and non-arbitrarily, and that is marking the most difficult part. They must have a mechanism that also allows users to report illegal content and take swift action based on the notifications received. And you can understand how this can impact huge services like the world of Meta. Not only that, platforms are also required to analyze their specific risks and implement mitigation measures, for example, to counteract, disinformation or the inauthentic use of their services. Then there is the whole aspect of greater transparency and increased accountability, because platforms must ensure that their risk assessments and their compliance with all obligations imposed by the Digital Services Act are subjected this time to an external audit. Not internal anymore, but external and independent. You understand that this is important. Not only that, platforms are required to give researchers access to publicly accessible data. Then, it is not exactly known yet how there is time to understand which institutions will be specifically created and who the qualified researchers are, but it is already there. And then, regarding advertising, the situation gets tough, really tough, because platforms must make public and all the repositories of all the advertisements that have appeared on their interface. It will always be possible to see who is advertising what and where they have done it. And then they must publish transparency reports on content moderation decisions and risk management. Some platforms have already started doing this. Who does it apply to quickly? Well, the first entities to which these rules apply are called VLOP, a funny name that stands for Very Large Online Platform. The Very Large Online Platforms gatekeepers, the European Commission has already adopted the first designation decisions, meaning the first ones have been designated. Hello, you are a VLOP. And they have currently selected 17 large online platforms and 2 large online search engines with a scope that practically means they impact about 45 million active users per month. Okay, so I have a list, let me retrieve it, of who they are. The 17 that have been found so far, plus 2 more, are Alibaba with AliExpress, the Chinese market, the Amazon store, the Apple App Store, the online platform of Booking.com, Facebook, of course, Google Play, Google's Market, Google Maps with ads, etc., Google Shopping, even though it's not widely used in Italy, but it's there, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Snapchat, TikTok, and in addition to, Wikipedia and Twitter, which was in doubt for a while, but falls within, with big headaches for mask, really big. Then there are still YouTube, of course, and Zalando as a major platform, while the large search engines that have been declared as such and therefore must be included in this first phase are actually Google and Bing. Nothing new under the sun regarding these parts. What do they have to do? Well, the companies that were designated over the past month have 4 months until August 25th, 2023. I believe to comply with all the obligations set by the Digital Services Act. And it's difficult. Okay, it will be a lot of work. Why? Because obviously, okay, all the things, all the statements about granting autonomy and responsibility and protecting users online by imposing rules. But in reality, it's a lot of work to do. A lot. But it doesn't apply only to them. Many things apply a little to everyone. Let's look at some specific issues. I have more or less mentioned them before, but I would like to highlight 2 or 3 points that will really change our perception of a range of services. The first thing I would like to focus on, even though I mentioned it a bit earlier, is content moderation and dispute management, because the DSA places great emphasis on content moderation and dispute management. That is, when I disagree with a decision that has been made, the basic goal, of course, is to try to ensure that platforms act responsibly, both in managing content, that is, by removing illegal and harmful things, obviously, and on the other hand, by respecting fundamental rights. And some of the measures introduced in this area are stringent, such as notice and action, meaning that platforms are required to implement a notification and action mechanism that allows users to easily report illegal or harmful content. but also obliges them to act promptly to assess it, and of course, if necessary, remove or disable the reported content. Then, a formal internal complaint procedure, that is, the DSA requires online platforms to establish internal complaint procedures for users, those users whose content has been removed, etc., but who believe that their content has been unjustly removed or that their rights have been violated. The platforms must review complaints impartially and provide a response within a reasonable time. Not only all these things, there are some things, but an additional layer is added, which is that of the extrajudicial dispute resolution mechanisms, that is, to ensure effective management of disputes between users and platforms. The DSA encourages the adoption of not just internal mechanisms, because otherwise it's the usual, right? The wine is good, but with the introduction of what are called extrajudicial dispute resolution mechanisms, such as mediation by an external entity or arbitration, these mechanisms offer a faster and more economical alternative to ordinary justice, meaning I have to turn to a judge or file a complaint, but at the same time, they provide a third-party perspective compared to the platform, which should help make decisions quicker at a certain point, but also more impartial. Actually, if implemented well, mediation allows for disputes to be resolved more quickly, let's put it that way. And then there are independent dispute resolution bodies. As I was saying, that is, the DSA provides the possibility of resorting to independent dispute resolution bodies, which can be designated either by individual member states or at the European level. These entities and areas will be responsible for evaluating user complaints and issuing binding recommendations and for the platforms. Okay, so another level still, if I don't like the decision, I appeal to that level. And there we're talking about the European level. So we're talking about something that puts a good part of the platforms against the wall. In summary, regarding content moderation, the management of disputes is one of the fundamental elements of the DSA. And we should soon see what this means. It's not over. Then there's a vast world concerning the issues of the DSA regarding targeting and advertising, meaning how I do advertising, how I find and target, not the advertisers, but the targeted audience, the public I want to reach. Why? Because the DSA focuses heavily on issues related to targeting and online advertising and seeks to balance the interests of platforms, advertisers, and for once, also those of users. In the attempt, you remember it by heart now, right, of responsibility, transparency, etc., it introduces a series of specific rules that are heavy to implement because some are an extension of what we already know, for example, transparency in online advertising. The DSA requires platforms to clearly disclose to users the origin of advertisements and the criteria used to target the audience, so it will no longer be just because you browsed, because you are on a mailing list, or because you have fake hair or things like that. This obviously allows users not only to understand the reasons why they see a particular advertisement, but also to exercise control and even go after those who misuse their data. Then there are enormous limitations on micro-targeting. The DSA addresses concerns related to micro-targeting quite head-on, which is the practice of directing advertisements to very specific segments based on a series of personal data. This practice, since Cambridge Analytica, has raised a series of concerns regarding user privacy and the manipulation of opinions and behaviors. The DSA could include a range of limitations on micro-targeting and actually imposes much stricter requirements for consent when using DSA data for advertising purposes. Then the fight against disinformation also comes into play here. The DSA requires platforms to adopt measures to combat the spread of disinformation, including through online advertisements. This means that platforms will have to put effort into monitoring and verifying advertisements. Not only that, but also collaborate with the competent authorities to identify and combat fraud and disinformation campaigns, which isn't bad, right? If you think about it, it's quite significant, and it's one of the most important challenges, in my opinion, both for the platforms, which obviously have to take all this into account, even when selling advertising services, which is no small feat, and for the users, because in this way they have a series of additional means to counteract this type of behavior. There are so many, but I wanted to focus on just one, because it's the one that I think many growth hackers still haven't understood, and that will come back like a boomerang. Why? Because the DSA explicitly refers to banning practices and commonly known as dark patterns. What are dark patterns? They are deceptive design practices, manipulating users, forcing them to make decisions that might not be in their best interest. Like, I don't know, allowing the collection of more data or adding unwanted items. The DSA addresses the issues of dark patterns and seeks to protect users from such practices, but in doing so, it destroys a good portion of those practices that you normally call growth hacking, the tricks of a growth hacker, which become illegal. The primary aimed goal regarding dark patterns is the protection of vulnerable users. The DSA pays attention to the protection of vulnerable users such as minors and the elderly who might be more easily influenced by dark patterns. The platforms must adopt a series of specific measures to protect these groups of users from deceptive and manipulative practices. Not only the DSA requires platforms to ensure transparency and clarity in their user interfaces, to avoid misleading users through the use of dark patterns. Therefore, platforms must provide clear and understandable information about the purposes and consequences of the different options presented to users. Hidden choices at the bottom, etc., become illegal as they become part of what are the direct patterns, but we will make a dedicated video on the direct patterns. Additionally, the DSA could introduce specific codes of conduct for platforms to prevent the use of dark patterns from the ground up and ensure a fairer and more transparent experience. For example, it may require that the choices presented to users are natural and not misleading, and that privacy configuration options are clearly visible and easily accessible. And there will indeed be a battle over dark patterns, and blood will be shed over dark patterns. Because those, as I was telling you, that the dark pattern calls, the DSA calls dark patterns, a lot of people around call them tricks or growth hacking. Let's wrap up. We've gone over 20 minutes. How should companies prepare for the DSA? Companies operating in the digital sector, of course, need to be ready to adopt the new rules and obligations introduced by the DSA. But to prepare, they should consider, let's put it this way, a series of steps very calmly. First, they get informed about the new regulations. I see very few companies that I know are impacted by the DSA that have understood the details and how it applies to their specific activities. It is important to consult industry experts and legal experts to truly get a clear understanding of the new rules, the responsibilities that come with them, and which parts of these rules are applicable to me. Then there's a significant part involving internal policies, because you need to review and update all internal policies related to online advertising, transparency, content moderation, and dispute management. This means that it will most likely be necessary to implement a whole series of new processes to respond to user reports or prevent the spread of illegal content much more quickly. Only does the problem arise because consider it is not just a technological problem, rather it is a procedural issue. Of course, then comes the adaptation of the systems. So updating and modifying the technological systems to ensure water, compliance with regulations, which means either implementing new tools, for example, for content moderation, transparency, algorithm transparency, which is even easier, and interoperability with different platforms, or also creating ad hoc solutions, of course. And then, of course, there's the training of the staff, because if the company personnel don't know what the new obligations are, it's clear that they can't comply with the management of these new bodies and these new internal obligations. So organizing training and update sessions is advisable, perhaps even generally on what the DSA is. Last but not least, monitoring and updating, meaning companies must be ready to monitor these new rules and also keep track of the execution times of various procedures, as well as monitor the updates that will occur on the DSA. However, those will happen more or less, but without adequately monitoring what happens and where it is. Somewhat foolish to implement just these steps. That's about it. The regulations. Make a final comment, and if you need anything, call. In conclusion, the DSA is a big, important step, and it's a step towards a radical change in the digital market with some specific rules within the European Union for the citizens of the European Union. Yes, many more rules are being introduced, but many more rights are also being introduced, and more rights and rights are always a good thing, obviously. It's also necessary to explain, and I started with this video, but I will continue to inform people about the additional rights they have, otherwise they can't exercise them. Go! Alright, we're done for today. If you want to learn more about the DSA and the new insights as we move forward, I invite you to subscribe to the channel now. There's also a wonderful Telegram group and a mailing list where extraordinary people, not me, talk and discuss these topics. Many of them are nerds. Just a heads up. That's it for now. If you're interested, there's a free course in the future that also covers these topics. Big deep breath. I hope I was helpful. And as always, thank you very much for listening to me, and stay prepared.